Hey guys, so today I'll tell you about John C. Lilly, how he invented the sensory deprivation tank, which is also known as a floating tank, and his as well as my own experiences with ketamine. So I recently read a book about John C. Lilly that actually inspired me for this video. It's called The Scientist, and yeah, I can really recommend reading this. So Lilly was born in 1915, and he played a great role in the counterculture of the 70s among people like Lilly and Ram Dass. He was trained as a physician, neuroscientist, and psychoanalyst, and was also active as philosopher, writer, inventor, and psychonaut. So he's most well known for his invention of the sensory deprivation tank, as well as giving LSD to dolphins in his attempt at establishing communication with them. So what actually led Lilly to initially build the tank was a working hypothesis he developed. He was wondering, like many others at that time, whether the brain needs some form of stimulation in order to be conscious. However, finding an answer to this question is not so easy as it may seem, since our own body, like for example our heartbeat or body temperature, these are all sensations that the brain is processing. So Lilly's solution to isolate this was to build a tank that not only is completely dark and isolated from auditory stimulation, but also contains water that has exactly body temperature. So he tried several different inventions with which he tried to retain the possibility to breathe. Mostly with the head underwater, he came to the really ingenious idea of putting kilos of Epsom salt into the water so that the person in the tank would float on top of the water without any effort, which is also why it's called the floating tank. So about the effects of the tank, generally people report experiencing deep inner peace, calmness, relaxation, euphoria, spiritual or creative insight, and even out-of-body experiences have been reported. Since the water is extremely thick, it's actually super easy to float on, and it's so easy that the body can relax all of its muscles. Another interesting effect of this invention is that since the water actually matches your body temperature, you kind of lose the feeling of where your own body ends and the external world begins. This kind of deflation of the bodily sense of self appears also to influence the narrative sense of self to deflate as well, which is also called ego dissolution. Personally, I also had an experience in an isolation tank, and I remember observing how myself experienced kind of a state of confusion. I did not really experience the deflation of my narrative sense of self, but I definitely experienced how the narrative and the bodily sense of self are connected and influence each other, and that it was very surprising to me and very confusing that I couldn't feel where my body ends, and therefore kind of where my self ends, I suppose. So I think it's also interesting to look at what happens at the neural level when you are in such a sensory deprivation tank, but there is not super much information out there yet. There is a study I found that looked at oscillatory activity, so brain waves, and they reported that alpha and beta waves, which are usually dominant during your waking state, especially beta waves, are very dominant when you're very alert. And so when you're in a sensory deprivation tank, they become much less dominant, while the theta wave actually gains oscillatory power. And the theta wave is the frequency band that is most active during a deep relaxation or light sleep. So it's especially during these states right before you fall asleep and right when you wake up. This is also really interesting because this state right when you wake up from sleep is reportedly also a state where you're extremely creative. So there are reports of people who say that right when they wake up, they immediately just write down their ideas that they have about, their startup or whatever they're working on. And yeah, these findings are also in line with studies that show that only 1 hour of floating equals actually 5 hours of sleep. So the way John C. Lilly actually describes his experiences in the tank in the book I was referencing earlier is definitely a bit more spaced out. One quote I really liked was, "I leave behind my human body and human mind and become a point of consciousness in an infinite space." So when he describes his trips, he talks about meeting 3 guardians from like a different dimension, I think. And at first he thinks that they're solely the product of his imagination, but at some point he comes to doubt that a bit more. And what I found really interesting is, and I can really relate to this in a way, is him saying that in order to function in this 3D matrix that we all live in, we have to at least doubt the existence of such entities. Because if we would fully accept that the world we perceive is an illusion and that there are these higher dimensions that, I don't know, act upon our dimension, we couldn't function anymore. And I think in some ways this really reminds me of, how there is this realization that everything is one, that everything is connected, and that the concepts we apply on the world are just concepts that don't describe what actually is. But then on the other side, that realization is, of course, incredibly beautiful, but then in order to function, in order to communicate, we have to divide the world in concepts. Like, how else would I report on my own perception? So another topic he touches on in the book is the mind-body problem. And he says that if the mind is bounded by the brain, then the size of the mind is a function of the size of the brain. So obviously humans in that case should have the most advanced or most complex consciousness, because our brain is the biggest, I think, at least. Whereas, for example, birds or chickens have a very, very small brain. His other line of thinking, which I think he ultimately agrees on, and I would definitely put my own opinion or my own way of reasoning on that too, is that if this is not the case, then the brain is more of a material valve of the universal mind, which regulates the amount of our revelations and the size of our knowledge through the brain. So personally, I really like the metaphor of a prism. And in this case, light would be consciousness and the prism would be the brain. And the more angles one prism has, the more colors it can generate and the more complex is its output. While of course the light is just omnipresent. It's everywhere. It's not distinct. So like I said earlier, John C. Lilly was also activism psychonaut, and he experimented with LSD, but mostly with ketamine in the tank. Ketamine was first synthesized in the 1960s and mainly used as an anesthetic and pain reliever. Later it became a famous party drug and recently has even been approved as an antidepressant. So on a neural level, ketamine is an NMDA antagonist, which results in a disruption of signal transmission in the brain. More specifically, it influences glutamate, which is a neurotransmitter the brain uses to communicate. And interestingly, at high doses, it blocks glutamate, so it blocks signal transmission, but at low doses, it actually heightens glutamate production. So at low doses, effects you may come across include hallucination and dissociation. It has also been found that novel pathways are used and therefore new connections between neurons are produced. And I think the neuronal explanation I can definitely relate to my own experience with ketamine, and one in particular I wanted to share here. So one night I took about, I think, 150 milligrams and started watching a movie. And watching a movie on ketamine is really interesting because you sort of feel like you're part of the movie and you start making things happen. I remember one scene in specifically where the person in the movie was asking a group of people if they still had any questions, and I was like, oh wait, do I have a question? And I was about to raise my hand when I realized, like, oh wait, I'm not actually in this movie. So what I'm trying to say is that you're really attentively watching the movie. And well, after the movie was done, we were sober again, and we went back to find a specific scene that we thought should be in the movie, but we didn't see somehow. And when we went back and looked at all the frames we skipped through, we realized that the entire movie was completely new to us. It was as if we had never seen this movie, which, yeah, just really blew my mind. So I think this experience really connects to hallucination and dissociation that I was mentioning earlier, which is especially interesting to explain in terms of predictive processing, I think. So in predictive processing, if you haven't heard about it, it describes mainly two processes. The bottom-up process, it contains all of your sensations of the world, so the sensory input, and the top-down process contains all of your beliefs, concepts, and models of the world. So consider the situation of being in a forest and seeing a curly thing in the tree. Your top-down process may say, well, this is a branch, because this is what you've always seen in trees, so this is what you believe about trees. This is your concept, your model of how trees look like. On the other side, your bottom-up process may hold the hypothesis that this is a toxic snake. So what happens is that both report on the evidence that they have. So how sure are they about their hypothesis? And then they kind of like meet somewhere in the middle depending on who's more sure of their evidence. A mathematical formula that comes in here that tries to explain this is the Bayesian theorem. This explains the probability of a hypothesis given the evidence. Now, if we think back to ketamine, it's as if the brain basically disregards the bottom-up evidence about what happens in the real world out there and gives almost all the weight to the internal concepts. And then this obviously leads to hallucination and dissociation. And I guess that this process will be most likely enhanced in a sensory deprivation tank where, well, there is no sensory input, so the bottom-up process has basically no value at all. Okay, so overall I think ketamine is an incredibly interesting substance that personally I don't really understand yet. I don't really understand my experience. And I think this gets even harder because the signal disruption that I was talking about earlier, I have a guess that is probably also hampering with memory consolidation. So I think it's really difficult to assess such a trip in retrospect. But yeah, nonetheless, very interesting topics, I think. So yeah, this was it for me today. I hope you enjoyed and see you next time. Bye.